Welcome to Ballot Battleground Nevada. I'm your host, Ben Marjat, a reporter at KRNV News 4 in Reno. I'm passionate about making politics in this critical battleground state more digestible to the average voter and pushing past the talking points to press politicians for answers. On this show, we take deep dives into the people, ideas, and debates shaping Silver State politics. Next month, Nevadans will decide if the Silver State will become the fourth state to use open primaries and ranked choice voting to pick its representatives. The proposed reform is currently in use in Maine, Alaska, and for certain statewide elections in Hawaii. Nevada's proposed system is a little different than these states, of course, but the concept is mostly the same. So we thought, before Nevadans decide whether to make this revolutionary change, that we'd take a closer look at how it's worked in other states. Has it been smooth? Have there been hiccups? Has it taken longer to get results? And do people like it? This week, you'll hear from two veteran reporters who have covered the implementation of ranked choice voting in their state, starting with Maine, the first state to use ranked choice voting, and Alaska, which is using it now but is considering a measure to repeal ranked choice voting this year. We'll begin this episode with Gregg Lagerquist, longtime Maine politics reporter, and then hear from James Brooks, longtime Alaska politics reporter. I thought both Gregg and James offered some great insights into how this transition has played out in their states, and I really think you'll benefit from these conversations. All right, first up, our chat with Gregg. Okay, Gregg Lagerquist, anchor and political reporter at CBS 13 WGME in Portland, Maine, joining Ballot Battleground Nevada. Gregg, thank you so much for doing this and for making me think about lager.
Yeah, well, thank you, Ben, for having me. You're right. I always tell people Lagerquist is Swedish for the quest for beer, which of course is not true, but who cares? It makes for a good story. But it helps people pronounce it correctly. So Lagerquist.
There we go. Lagerquist. Okay, I have to ask you before we dive into the main topic today, ranked choice voting. You got one of the first ever Walter Cronkite Awards for Excellence in Political Coverage. I just read this. It's on your bio. I went to the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism. So how cool is that? Especially you got to meet Mr. Cronkite when he was alive, right?
I did. Yeah. I was going to say I got that award, and it was for covering ballot initiatives, of which one of we're about to talk about here on your podcast. But yeah, I won that, I think, like 25 years ago now. It's been a long time. But yeah, that was one of the professional honors of my life, was to meet Walter Cronkite in person.
That's really cool. We could chat for a half an hour about meeting Walter Cronkite, the legend. But first, let's kind of talk about who you are for our audience is new to you, and kind of your experience covering Maine politics for some time now.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ben. Yeah, I've been covering Maine politics for almost 30 years now. I try not to admit my age, but I guess I just revealed it. You know, I've covered every New Hampshire primary, for example, which is right across the border from us here in Maine. It's going back to 1996. And again, I've covered Maine politics since the mid 90s. So it's been a long time. And Maine has a very robust referendum system. We have a lot of issues that come up, and ranked choice voting was one of them a number of years ago. So, you know, I'm into politics. I know a lot of people probably I feel like two types of people. There are people who run to cameras and run away from cameras when it comes to people we're trying to interview. And there are people who love politics and those who want to have nothing to do with it. Hopefully we'll find some middle ground for our podcast here. But yeah, I love politics, always have. So I'm thrilled to be here today.
Awesome. Well, yeah, you're a perfect guest for this show. So let's start from when the ranked choice voting effort or push really began in earnest in Maine. When did it start? When did it start to gain steam?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. It actually started around the time I won that Walter Cronkite Award. The first actual legislative bill that was put in before the Maine legislature to introduce ranked choice voting in Maine was way back in 2001. So it was a long time ago. And literally there were some representatives who put it in every single session for more than a decade trying to get this passed. And it failed. It failed every time throughout the early 2000s. And it finally passed under a ballot initiative, a statewide referendum in 2016. And it went into effect. The first time it really was going into effect would have then been 2018, our first round of elections that it had a direct impact. So it was a long fight in Maine. And I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it didn't pass by a vast majority. It was fairly close. But voters said, yeah, let's give this a try. And helping that in Maine was the fact that there was already some local municipalities, for example, Portland, the largest city in Maine, Portland, Maine, by the way, the first Portland, not the one out in Oregon. Portland, Maine had ranked choice voting for local municipal elections for city council seats, for example, before there was the statewide vote. So there had been some experience with it in that regard. But yeah, passed became a statewide law in 2016, and we've been having it ever since.
Interesting. Yeah, you guys kind of seem like the incubator, if you will, having
Yeah,
used
one
it
of the first.
at the city level, and I believe the first to implement it statewide in 2016.
Mhm.
It's a little bit different than the law that is proposed here in Nevada. So just walk me through the nuts and bolts of, is it open primaries and then is it final five, final four? How exactly does it work?
Yeah, no, it's open. It's everybody who makes the ballot is in ranked choice. So, for example, we've had some municipal elections in Portland where there have been like 5 or 6 or 8 candidates for mayor, for example,
Mm,
and ranked choice will go through the way it's designed. The way it was sort of sold to voters, and I think that similar sort of selling points from supporters in Nevada is it's sort of an instant runoff, right? That's the view. Like, hey, you're going to have if you're going to try to get to a majority, not just a plurality. So you got to get to 50% of the vote plus one vote in order to
mhm.
win. And if it's a open election, every single person who qualifies for a ballot, whether at the statewide level or frankly federal races, the ranked choice voting in Maine applies to federal candidates as well. So everybody who makes the ballot is subject to ranked choice voting, and they'll just obviously eliminate from the bottom one person at a time, then sending their votes of that last place person to the ones above them. And if no one's gotten to a majority after that happens,
Yeah.
you go one by one until most of the times you end up with two people standing. And one of those people will be above 50%. So that's been our experience here in Maine. One quirk to Maine, and I think this is not really relevant to Nevada, but the only race and seat that it doesn't apply to in Maine is governor. And that's because there's a specific line in the Maine state constitution that refers to electing a governor of Maine by plurality. And it was adjudicated, it was looked at, and they said, you know what? We don't think ranked choice applies to the governor's race only because the Constitution speaks to voting, allowing somebody to be elected by a plurality, meaning less than 50% of the vote. As long as you are the one with the most votes, you don't have to get to 50% to win. So that's only the governor's race in Maine. So kind of a quirk to
Yeah.
our system, but so far voters seem fairly comfortable with it. So it's been,
Yeah.
like we said, it's been 6, 8 years now.
Just to clarify, so there is no primary that narrows down the long list of candidates to a shorter list. It's
No,
every.
and it depends on the race.
Yeah.
Mayoral races do not have a primary in Maine, for example. Legislative races can, but in many cases, so if you have even a congressional race, it does apply to primaries in Maine as well. And then the winners of that will win the state primary and they move on to our Maine has its primaries the presidential primary is in March usually here in Maine. And the statewide primary, which applies to statewide races and legislative races and often local races as well, happens the second Tuesday of June. So then we would narrow it down. And the ones who tend to be the other candidates on the ballot by the time we get to the general election in the fall are those independents. Maine has a lot of independents. For example, right now, Maine is the only state that has an independent, Angus King, who, by the way, is up for re-election and will be subject to ranked choice voting. He's the only independent currently in the United States Senate, it's my understanding, because Bernie Sanders, I think, didn't he officially I got to think about that for a second.
Yeah.
Anyway, one of the very few independent, there's a robust
Sure.
history of independence in the state of Maine. So that's when we get to the general election. Those are the folks who are, for example, I just mentioned the U.S. Senate race in Maine. There are two independents who've made the ballot, and there's a Republican and the Democratic nominees. So all four of those candidates will be on the ballot in Maine here in less than 5 weeks now. And it will be subject to ranked choice voting. So we'll see. Angus King is the presumptive leader, according to the early polls, an popular incumbent. So he might already be above 50% by the time the votes are tallied, or he might be below. And if that's the case, we'll start to do ranked choice voting.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So our listeners here in Nevada hopefully are familiar with Nevada's initiative, which
Mhm.
is different because we're narrowing it down to the final five. So that is a
Yes.
caveat. It differs significantly from Maine's, but in the end, ultimately, it is that instant runoff, the ranked choice voting in the general election. Has it worked as intended?
It depends
And
on who
have
you
there been
ask.
hiccups? Okay.
I wouldn't say there've been any hiccups. It's worked smoothly. So there's two caveats to this that people should expect when it comes to ranked choice voting. One is that it tends to take time. Sometimes if it's a close race, you will not know the outcome of the election for potentially days after the polls close, after election
Mhm.
day,
Yeah.
because it takes some time to go through the ranked choice process. So we've had examples where it's been a close race where it's been 4, 5, 6 days before a winner's been declared after the ranked choice process plays out. So that's one thing that voters, I think, do need to get used to. And I think that that's one place where some folks have said, hey, this is, maybe not working the way we intended. Although important to note, structurally, legally, there have been no hiccups. It's worked fine. It's worked the way it was promised and intended. But that's one thing. Two, we have already had one case where, and it was in a congressional race in Maine's
Mm.
second district. Maine has two congressional seats, and Maine's second district is a very purple district and actually leaning slightly red. Currently, it has a Democratic congressman representing it, but he upset the incumbent in 2018 under ranked choice voting. So,
Mm.
follow along here, folks. After the first round, the incumbent Republican, Bruce Poliquin, won the race after the first round of voting, but he only had about 47% of the vote in 2018.
Wow.
So there was an independent, there were three candidates on the ballot, an independent, the Democratic nominee, and the Republican nominee. The first round, the Democrat was in second, the Republican was in first, the independent a distant third. They went to ranked choice runoff. About 80%, as I recall it, of the votes for that independent then broke
Mm.
for the Democrat. And that
Mm.
Democrat, actually, I have the numbers right here. It was, as the Mainers would say, wicked close. The final was, 50.6% for the Democrat, now incumbent Jared
Wow.
Golden, to 49.4% for the Republican, who at that point had been the incumbent. So
Mm.
right out of the bat, literally 2018 was the first year that Maine started applying ranked choice voting to congressional races. And right away, we had a flip. If there had not been ranked choice voting, Bruce Poliquin would have won that race. The Republicans would have retained control of the seat. Because there was ranked choice voting, it flipped. The Democrat then, after the apportion of the third candidate's votes, got to above 50% and was declared the winner. So two ways to look at that. One, did it work the way it was said it would and the way it was promised? Yeah, it did.
Yeah.
If you're a Republican, or especially if you're Bruce Poliquin, are you very angry at that outcome? Yes, you are. And
Yeah.
we should make it clear too, Ben. It's not, I think that Democrats tend to be more in favor of ranked choice voting than Republicans do. But in theory, ranked choice shouldn't benefit one party or the other, depending on the political dynamics of the particular race at stake. So there could be, for example, a Republican district where there's a Republican right-leaning independent stealing votes, quote unquote, stealing votes away from the Republican, and the Democrat might be ahead after the first round. And after you apportion those third or even fourth, or in Nevada's case, up to 5 candidates, you might then see the Republican win. So it's in theory non-partisan, but so far, the only big example we've had in Maine was it flipped a Republican seat to a Democratic seat after they used it. So that
Interesting.
that ruffled some feathers, to be sure.
I'm sure. Yeah. It seems like the research I've done, roughly 90% or maybe more of elections that are run, it's the person that gets the most votes in the first round goes on
Yes.
to win, but you still have every once in a while kind of that upset, if you will. Have voters been confused by this, or have they come to understand it and appreciate it?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ben. I think for the most part, voters do understand it. And again, appreciate might be a weighted word because, like I said, I think there are still some who feel like it benefits one party over the other, although it should be apolitical. But I do think that I think that Maine voters are comfortable with it. There still are clearly some voters who may not like it, but I think that the vast majority of voters understand it and are comfortable with it as a concept and a process. They're not like confused by it still. But there was a lot of splaining that we had to do early on,
Yeah.
especially we covered it extensively in 2016 because it was a statewide ballot question. So we did a
Yeah.
lot of reporting in 2016 as voters were going to have to make up their minds on this, just as they are in Nevada in 2024.
Absolutely. We are explaining left and right here on our end as well. One last question before we go. Later on in this episode, we're hearing from an Alaska reporter who's telling us about the effort to potentially repeal ranked choice voting in Alaska. Has there been any sort of movement along that front in Maine, or do you feel like it's pretty much cemented?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. There were efforts in the legislature to repeal the law because ultimately it is, it's a state statute that created this in 2016 in Maine. So there have been efforts to repeal it. So far, those efforts have failed. And so I would say it's on very firm footing. I would not say it's, cemented that it would never be repealed,
Sure.
but there's definitely, I think, a comfort. And I think that calls to repeal it have been muted over the
Mm.
last few years. There were, as you might imagine, as we were saying a moment ago, after 2018, after the outcome of that congressional race, there were some loud cries to repeal it. And by the way, it was challenged in court. Bruce Poliquin
Mm.
challenged ranked choice voting in court
Really?
after the outcome he lost. And they upheld the law and they upheld the ruling. So in essence, that experience with that close of a race and with the outcome changing actually led to a court case that essentially helped to further codify it, that there's precedent in Maine law that
Right.
affirms ranked choice voting. So, yeah, it's a long way of saying that I think it's pretty firmly established in Maine right now, but never say never.
Of course. Yeah. And I lied. One last question, which is
Sure.
any words of caution or advice, or maybe things that Nevadans voters here should be thinking about as they're kind of weighing this reform that to us here in the Silver State is new and we haven't had it for many years like you guys?
Yeah, I would say that again. You think about what you're comfortable with. The voters I've heard who really like it, and I've heard this frankly from people across the political spectrum who like the idea. We've heard that about wasting your vote. For example, I know I've talked to folks here in Maine who are in favor of RFK Jr. And by the way, he's still on the ballot in Maine and will stay on the ballot. And the old saw is do I really want to quote waste a vote on
Sure.
a third party or fringe or distant third candidate? Well, when there's ranked choice voting, there's no such thing as a wasted vote. You vote for who you want, and you have the choice, by the way. That's something we should also mention, Ben. You have the choice. You don't have to list your second, third, fourth, or fifth choice on the ballot. You can do that in Nevada too. You can just
Right.
list
Yeah.
one. And if your person loses, then there's no ranked choice vote that's coming from you. But if you do want to rank them, then you can do that. And then, hey, I'm going to vote for, in my example, RFK Jr., but then I'm going to put second Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. And then my second choice I know is most likely to actually get my vote. And I haven't, quote, wasted a vote. That's been one of the biggest arguments in favor of it. But that's something voters should really kind of absorb. And again, the other thing that it could take, like I mentioned earlier, there can be time, there can be a delay. I wouldn't call it confusing, but it is somewhat complicated in
Sure.
terms of the process of counting the votes. So there's that factor too. And three, you got to be comfortable with the idea that you may have an outcome where somebody could win under a plurality and that can flip. So I
Yeah.
guess those would be the words of quote unquote caution. But as long as voters understand what they're voting for, that's the case in any election. Understand what you're voting
Yep.
for and go ahead and pull the trigger.
Absolutely. And that's what we're trying to do with this podcast and with our question 3 debate and with the help of you. So thank you so much, Greg, for joining us. I think that was a really succinct, simple way to understand how this has played out in your state. Appreciate getting some of your time, Greg. We'll let you get back to reporting on Maine politics.
Thanks very much, Ben. I appreciate your time. I appreciate being here.
While ranked choice voting in Maine is, in Gregg's words, on pretty firm footing, it is a much different case in Alaska, whose voters will vote in November on whether or not to repeal ranked choice voting. James Brooks gave some great insight into the rollout and the pushback to RCV in Alaska. Here's our conversation. And I'm thrilled now to be joined by James Brooks Cascade, the state reporter for the Alaska Beacon, a wonderful independent, nonpartisan news organization. And James, you are based in Juneau, right? So how much daylight do you still have this time of year?
We're over the hump. It's on the downhill now, but it's still a nice fall day. So we're going to enjoy it while we can before the darkness hits.
Yeah, come winter solstice time, you guys probably get very jealous of us. But okay, thank you so much for doing this, James, for making the time. We do appreciate it because we want to learn more about how ranked choice voting and open primaries have worked in other states. Before we get specifically into those election reforms, just tell us about yourself and kind of your experience covering Alaska politics, how long you've been doing it, and why you love reporting in Alaska.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely an interesting place. I've been a journalist in Alaska since 2008. I've been covering the state government and state politics, I'd say since 2015, 2014 is when I got into it in earnest. And it's just a fascinating place. There's always something new happening in Alaska, and you can be close to it all the time. It's the smallest state legislature in the country, and so you get to know everybody pretty darn well.
To us that live in the lower 48, it is just a fascinating place. I can't wait to go up there and visit you guys sometime. But let's dive into ranked choice voting and open primaries here. When did kind of the movement begin in Alaska? How did it come to be that these were in your state law and now in use today?
It actually got started with an attorney here in Alaska named Scott Kendall. He was the chief of staff for independent former governor Bill Walker, and he started out by writing this, wasn't getting support from outside. He did get some funding once he started writing the initiative that turned into Alaska's ranked choice open primaries law. brought in another elections attorney and then got the ball rolling from there. And then that was on the ballot in Alaska in 2020. Here it was a statutory change, not a constitutional one. It just had to pass once, and it did so by a small margin, less than 1% of the votes altogether.
Wow. So 2022 was the first election when it was in effect for Alaska, right? Tell us though about kind of the nuances of the law there, which races it applies to, its final four, unlike, final five here in Nevada, and kind of exactly the nuances of this law specifically.
Yeah, Alaska's law is fairly similar to Nevada's. It's a Final Four system, starting with the open primary. Any number of candidates for a particular race can run, and regardless of party, the four top vote getters from that advance on to the general election. And in that general election, we use ranked choice voting. Pick one, pick two, pick four, or even five if you count in the write ins as well.
Hmm.
And then we do the tabulation and see who wins after that. And the winner goes on from there.
So 2022, the first election when this was in effect, how did it go? Because we are hearing a lot of different arguments for and against here, a lot of fear mongering. It's going to take many weeks to count. It's going to be complicated and confusing. Has that been your experience?
And Alaska actually got a shock start to it with the death of its longtime Congressman, Don Young, in early 2022. So our first ranked choice election was a special election happening on short notice.
Hmm.
And so the primary took place with 48 candidates all competing for that open
Oh
seat.
my gosh, you're kidding.
Yeah, and so it was including Santa Claus. You can't forget him. I believe he finished 6th when
Oh
all
my
was said
gosh.
and done. And so that went down, and then we had, Mary Peltola, the current US House representative, elected for the remainder of Don Young's term, and then we did it all over again for the general election, and Peltola won again that year. Somebody your listeners and viewers might be familiar with, Sarah Palin, was in that race as well. Peltola
Yeah.
defeated her and another Republican as well, Nick Begich, who is now running against Peltola again this year.
Did the fears of it being too complicated or confusing for voters, it taking too long to count, did those things materialize?
Generally, no, but it'll depend who you talk to. If you talk to people who don't like the system, they'll say, well, there were a large number of exhausted ballots when all was said and done. People who picked just one candidate, their pick wasn't in the final two, so their vote was eliminated, their ballot was exhausted. They're still not happy with that system and how things are going. But by and large, polling seems to indicate that people found it easy to use and that it was effective.
How long did it take to tally and release all the results? Something that I read researching for our debate that we're doing is that the ranked choice results aren't released until like the 15th day after the election. Is that correct?
That's correct, but that's a choice by the Alaska Division of Elections. In Alaska, ballots can arrive up to 15 days after Election Day if they're mailed from overseas and still be counted as long as they're postmarked on or before Election Day. And so the Division of Elections made the choice to wait until that 15th day till the cutoff for arriving ballots in order to do the tabulations. The thought was that while they could do a tabulation after election day and do an immediate sort, it might be confusing for voters because the rankings could change quite a bit as more ballots arrive and are added to the calculations. So, unlike in other states and cities, Alaska waits and does one ranking when all is said and done. And I know there's lots of other places that do it differently. I was down in Oregon and talking to officials in Portland. They intend to do multiple rounds of tabulations because they say, "We think voters can handle it." And so it's really up to local officials on that.
Interesting. Yeah, and we'll point out, but that this will be up to Nevada lawmakers if this were to pass here in the Silver State. We don't know exactly how they would set it up, but in your case, at least, it did. They could wait until the 15th day after the election to find the ranked choice results. But it seems like in most cases, it is the person that gets the most votes in the first round of tallying that comes out as the winner. Has that been your experience?
It has. There were only, actually fewer than a handful of state legislative races that ended up changing, where the person leading on election day in the first choice total ended up losing, and just a handful of those, and there's some of those candidates who could support the system, some of those candidates who oppose ranked choice voting even though it benefited them, and it's kind of a mixed bag on that. But by and large, the winner or the leader, I should say, at the end of election day was who ended up going on winning. And
Hmm.
I should say that in Alaska, as in I believe Nevada's system, if somebody has more than 50% of the first choice votes, ranked choice voting doesn't even come into play. That person is the winner without going to rankings.
Yep, you got it right. Yeah, that's how it would work in Nevada as well. So, one of the thoughts of how this could kind of lower the temperature is that you'd have candidates that need to appeal to a broader share of the electorate, not just kind of the extremists on one side or the other. They need to appeal to the moderates in the middle to clear that 50% threshold. And the argument and the thought being that this would kind of lower the temperature because you need to win more voters and win the voters of someone who might not support you on their first ballot. Have you, I know it's only been in effect kind of for one cycle so far, but have you anecdotally maybe seen some instances where that has happened, where the elections are a little more civil, the discourse is a little lower temperature?
I think that you see that the most in races with close results, that we're gonna be close either way, and you see that particularly in places where multiple candidates emerge from that open primary. If there's just 2 candidates, obviously ranking doesn't matter in the general election, but if you have 4 candidates, a full slate in Alaska's system, then you see people really playing nice, I'd say. Back
Mm.
in the US House election 2 years ago, we saw plenty of people remarking how Mary Peltola, the ultimate winner in the race, was very friendly, outgoing with her competitors. Sarah Palin even remarked at that, just saying she's so doggone nice, and didn't have a bad word to say about her. And that ended up working for Peltola as Begich and Palin, her 2 Republican challengers, really attacked each other and ended up not winning.
Walk me through how ranked choice voting played out in you guys had a Senate election in 2022, right? Where Lisa Murkowski, if I'm getting this right, emerged victorious. I think, at least from the national perspective, you're on the ground. So correct me if I'm wrong here, but the perception was maybe that someone like Senator Murkowski, who's a bit more moderate and centrist, might not have prevailed under the first past the post system that had been in place before.
And this is where the open primary comes into play because we've actually seen that kind of thing happen before. Murkowski actually lost the 2010 US Senate Republican primary and ended up staying in office because of a huge, unprecedented, at least in the last 50 years, write in campaign that got her on the ballot and kept her in office. And so, with the open primary aspect of things, which is honestly in some places even more significant than ranked choice voting, she was able to avoid a really contested Republican primary, go into the general election where her moderation helped her.
As you say, by and large, it seems that most people are satisfied with how it's played out. There is this effort underway now. It sounds like it's going to be on your ballot next month to potentially repeal ranked choice voting. Walk us through how that came to be, who's pushing that, where that's come from.
Alaska doesn't have a far left segment of the political spectrum, at least not an organized one and not in any large numbers. So under ranked choice voting, under the open primary, the people who are disadvantaged are the far right, extreme conservatives who are unhappy that they can no longer have a disproportionate say in the Republican primary because under the old system, the farther right you were, the bigger advantage you'd have in a Republican primary and be much more likely to advance to the general election. And that matters in a lot of districts because the Republican candidate would be favored.
Mm,
Now, with multiple Republicans advancing, moderate Republicans are favored. And so if you're on the far right, you don't like that as much. And so
mm.
that's where we're seeing a large push to repeal the system. They're very passionate And right now, they seem to have the enthusiasm advantage when it comes to voting on a repeal initiative in November. Now, there's still a whole month of campaigning to go. The people trying to preserve Alaska's current system are extremely well funded and doing a lot of advertising, and they're focusing on the open primary rather than the ranked choice aspect. Because if you look at opinion polling, at least what's been released here, the open primary is still really popular. The ranked choice aspect doesn't poll as well. In fact, if you just look at that section in isolation, there's a greater number of people who oppose the ranked choice voting. But when you add the open primary into the equation, it's really close to 50-50.
Yeah, we've seen that anecdotally here as well. Seen just a ton of Facebook comments. I'm all for open primaries, some people say, and ranked choice voting, no. And some people wish that it was split up. But proponents, of course, will say that these kind of go hand in hand. So you said it passed by a pretty slim margin in 2020, right?
Hmm.
Okay, so we know there's a majority of Alaskans, at least as of 4 years ago, that supported this. Polling shows that people are generally supportive. I'm not going to ask you to, predict how things would go, but I don't know. Do you think the political winds have shifted enough in the 4 years that you think there's a chance this could be repealed, or no?
I do. I think it'll be fairly close regardless, but I think if the election were held today, the polling indicates that repeal would pass.
Hmm.
Now, whether that'll stay the case on election day remains to be seen, but based on just the polling that we've seen, that's what we can say.
Interesting. Okay. Any other insights or things from, again, a state that has used this now for the last 4 years? Wisdom, insights, advice for Nevada as Nevadans are kind of considering this in less than a month's time?
A few things. One thing that came up 4 years ago was that the Alaska Democratic Party and the Republican Party were both opposed to the system. 4 years on, and having seen Democrats win the U.S. House seat, the party is officially in favor. The Democratic Party is now officially in favor
Hmm.
of the system, even if they're not enthusiastically in favor, I would say. So we have seen a change in that. Democrats who were opposed to it 4 years ago are now in favor of it, or at least not opposing it. And it's also been interesting to see the way that campaigns have changed as a result of the open primary and ranked choice voting. You see a lot of candidates entering races and then withdrawing to throw support behind a preferred candidate that they think will do better
Hmm.
in the ranked choice matchup. In
Interesting.
Alaska, yeah, in Alaska, we had a large number of Republican races where candidates withdrew in order to back a preferred Republican. That most notably happened in the U.S. House race, where we saw the state's lieutenant governor withdraw from the U.S. House race after finishing behind fellow Republican candidate Nick Begich. The thought being that Republicans are a lot less willing to rank multiple candidates, so they're worried that if there are multiple Republicans on the ballot, Republican voters won't rank them, and they'll be at a disadvantage if a lower finishing Republican is eliminated.
Interesting. Yeah, because you hear the argument that this eliminates the possibility of spoilers because, your second choice vote would then just be allocated to your second candidate. But you're saying that people are still worried about people not filling out the full ballot. They don't want to risk it or chance it, and so they just drop out.
Yeah, it only eliminates spoilers if you use the system as intended. And what we've seen in Alaska from the two elections that we had in 2022, and then what we're starting to see from the primary this year and potentially the general election, is that a large number of voters don't want to use ranked choice voting. And so the spoiler effect stays in place. Now, I think that if repeal fails and the system sticks around, we're going to see a change in attitudes even after that, because candidates will realize this is the system that's going to stick around. You have to convince voters to rank, but that's a hypothetical for the future.
Interesting. Okay, James Brooks with the Alaska Beacon. Really appreciate it. I thought that was very insightful conversation for our listeners who are considering this question 3 right now. So we appreciate getting some of your time and keep the faith as that winter solstice approaches up there.
Will do, Ben. Thanks a lot.
special thanks to both Gregg and James for making time to join us this week. If you missed our big announcement last week, we're hosting a debate on Question 3, Nevada's open primaries and ranked choice voting initiative, with 2 representatives from each side of the issue here. We just taped it, and we're putting the finishing touches on it right now. Our Question 3 debate will air on Tuesday, October 15th at 4:30 on both News 4 and Fox 11 here in Northern Nevada, as well as on KSNV News 3 in Las Vegas. Plus, the full debate, including a handful of bonus questions you won't see on TV, will be available here in this podcast feed immediately after it airs on television. It's been all hands on deck as we produced and prepped for that debate, so we don't have a fact check segment for you this week, but we plan to continue it in our next episode. This is the part of the show where we normally ask for a rating and a review, and of course, you should do that, but something a little different too. If this show helped you become a more informed voter, if you learned something, if it made you rethink something, if you think others would benefit from listening, please share it with them. Post this show on social media, tell a friend, drop it in the family group chat, wherever. Word of mouth really is the best way to get the word out about this show. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back in your feed with an all-new episode next week. See you then.